My husband, the CEO, gave my promotion and raise to his mistress in front of everyone. They thought I would break. They had no idea I was about to take everything. Subscribe, like, and comment. I'm ready below to let me know you're here. Let's get into the story. The reflection staring back at Eleanor Vance from the polished chrome of the elevator doors was one of controlled, quiet power. Her silver-streaked dark hair was pulled into a severe but elegant chignon, a style that allowed no room for frivolity. Her charcoal gray suit was tailored to perfection, a silent testament to a woman who understood that in the world of corporate titans, perception was reality. At 48, Eleanor moved with the frictionless grace of someone who had not only earned her seat at the table but had, on many occasions, built the table herself. As the COO of Vance Innovations, she was the engine to her husband's vision. Mark Vance was the face. Charismatic, bold, a master of the handshake and the inspiring speech. But Eleanor was the architect. She was the one who translated his grand proclamations into actionable strategies, who balanced the budgets, and who smoothed the feathers of the brilliant but temperamental engineers in R&D. Her phone buzzed. A text from Liam, the head of sales. "They're signing. Wire transfer initiated." "You did it, Eleanor." A small, contained smile touched her lips. The Axiom deal. 6 months of grueling negotiations, transatlantic flights, and poring over contractual minutiae until 3 a.m. Mark had wanted to pull out twice, frustrated by the client's demanding terms. Eleanor had held firm, meticulously restructuring the deal until it was not just palatable, but wildly profitable. That 7-figure contract was now the jewel in the crown of their third-quarter earnings, the very earnings Mark was about to present to the board. The elevator sighed to a stop on the 40th floor. The executive suite. Polished marble floors, floor-to-ceiling glass walls offering a panoramic view of the city, and the subtle, expensive scent of success. Her heels clicked with purpose as she walked towards the main boardroom. "Morning, Eleanor," her assistant, a bright young man named Ben, said, falling into step beside her. "You look ready for battle." "It's not a battle, Ben. It's a victory lap," she corrected him gently. "Is the final presentation loaded?" "Yes, and the preliminary numbers from the Axiom deal are included in the appendix, just as you asked." Mark was very pleased. Mark was pleased. The phrase hung in the air. For 20 years, her professional life had revolved around that sentiment. In the beginning, it had been a shared goal, a partnership forged in a tiny apartment with a business plan sketched on a napkin. They were a team. Now it felt different. His pleasure was the objective. Her work was the means to that end. She pushed the thought aside. Today was not a day for introspection. Today was a day of triumph. The agenda for the 10 a.m. executive meeting included the official announcement of a new senior vice president of global strategy. It was a role created specifically to recognize the expanding scope of the company's operations, a scope Eleanor herself had engineered. The position was hers. It was an open secret, the logical next step in her career, the culmination of 2 decades of relentless dedication. Mark had all but promised it to her over dinner last week, a casual, "We need to make your authority official, Ellie," spoken between sips of a Napa Cabernet. She paused outside the glass doors of the boardroom. Inside, the executive team was already gathering. Mark stood at the head of the mahogany table, laughing at something the CFO said. He looked every bit the part of the visionary CEO. Impeccable suit, a confident posture that owned the room. He caught her eye and gave her a brilliant smile, a flash of white teeth that used to make her heart skip a beat. Today, it simply felt like part of the performance. Taking a deep breath, Eleanor smoothed the front of her jacket. This was it. The final acknowledgement. The official crowning of her achievements. She pushed the door open and stepped into the room, the architect ready to claim her place in the cathedral she had built. The air in the boardroom was thick with anticipation. The scent of fresh coffee mingled with the dry, clean smell of the air conditioning. Eleanor took her usual seat to the right of Mark, the place of the CEO, the second in command. She arranged her leather-bound notebook and pen on the table, her movements precise and economical. Across the table, she noticed Rachel Peters, a junior executive from the marketing department, watching her. Rachel was young, ambitious, with a hungry look that Eleanor recognized because she used to see it in her own mirror. She offered Rachel a polite, professional nod. Rachel's answering smile was a little too wide, a little too bright. The meeting began as expected. Mark guided them through the quarterly earnings with his typical flair, turning balance sheets and projections into a thrilling narrative of conquest. He gave Eleanor a public nod for her work on the Axiom deal. An absolute masterstroke, orchestrated by our own Eleanor Vance. Let's have a round of applause for her. The applause was genuine. Eleanor felt a flush of pride, the familiar warmth of a job well done. She glanced at Mark, and he gave her a quick, conspiratorial wink, as if to say, "Just wait for the main event." Finally, after the last of the departmental reports, Mark stood up again, his expression turning more formal. And that brings us to our final item on the agenda. As you know, Vance Innovations is expanding at an unprecedented rate. Our global footprint requires a new level of strategic oversight. To that end, the board has approved the creation of a new vital role: Senior Vice President of Global Strategy. This was it. Eleanor kept her expression neutral, but her heart beat a little faster. She could feel the eyes of the other executives on her. They all knew. This was her moment. This person will be responsible for guiding our international expansion, for identifying new markets, and for ensuring that the Vance Innovations brand becomes synonymous with excellence worldwide, Mark continued, his voice resonating with importance. The role comes with a significant increase in responsibility, and, of course, a substantial raise to reflect that. He paused, letting the weight of the announcement settle. He swept his gaze around the room, a practiced move of a showman building suspense. His eyes landed on Eleanor. He smiled, a broad, almost intimate smile. For a split second, she allowed herself to feel the pure, unadulterated joy of the moment. 25 years. The late nights, the missed holidays, the personal sacrifices, all of it had led to this. Then his gaze shifted, moving past her. And so, it is my immense pleasure to announce that I am appointing Rachel Peters to this position. The words hit the silent room like a physical blow. A collective, invisible gasp seemed to suck the air from the space. Eleanor's mind went blank. She felt a roaring in her ears, a sudden, dizzying sense of dislocation, as if the floor had dropped away beneath her. Had to be a mistake. Joke. A slip of the tongue. She looked at Mark, expecting him to laugh and correct himself. But he wasn't looking at her. He was smiling at Rachel, who was now standing, her face a mask of practiced humility, a blush rising on her cheeks. Rachel has shown incredible initiative and a fresh perspective that I believe is exactly what we need to propel us into the future, Mark said, his voice unwavering. The other executives were frozen, their faces a mixture of shock and acute embarrassment. They stared at their notebooks, at the ceiling, anywhere but at Eleanor. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot wave that washed over her, prickling her skin. This wasn't just a professional slight. This was a public execution. He had let her believe, let everyone believe, that the promotion was hers, only to rip it away in the most public forum possible, in front of the very people she managed and led. The wink, the smile, it had all been a lie. A cruel, deliberate performance. He hadn't just passed her over. He had made her a fool. Eleanor's vision tunneled, the faces around the mahogany table blurring into a muted watercolor of shock and pity. The roaring in her ears subsided, replaced by a crystalline, ringing silence. Through it, Mark's voice sounded distant, as if coming from the other end of a long hallway. So let's all congratulate Rachel on her well-deserved promotion. A spattering of hesitant, awkward applause broke the tension. It was the sound of people going through emotion they didn't believe in. Eleanor remained seated, her spine ramrod straight. She could feel the weight of every gaze that darted toward her and then quickly away. She was a car crash on the side of the highway. No one wanted to stare, but no one could look away. Her mind, usually a whirlwind of strategy and calculation, was now a dead calm. The shock had burned away all emotion, leaving behind something cold and hard. Mark finally turned to her, his expression a careful blend of nonchalance and corporate authority. He was acting as if this were a completely normal business decision. "I can't wait for my raise," Eleanor said. The words came out of her mouth before she could stop them, a ghost of the conversation they'd had, of the future she had believed in only 10 minutes ago. Her voice was steady, devoid of the tremor she felt in her soul. Mark actually laughed. It was a short, dismissive sound that cut deeper than any shout could. "Raise." "Oh no, Ellie," he said, the condescending pet name a fresh twist of the knife. "I gave it to Rachel." He said it with a grand, magnanimous air, as if bestowing a great gift. As if Eleanor's expected compensation was his to simply re-gift to his new favorite. Before she could respond, Robert Hemlock, the head of HR, cleared his throat. He was a balding, nervous man who perpetually looked like he was delivering bad news. "To be clear, Eleanor," he began, shuffling papers that didn't need shuffling, "your compensation package wasn't under review this quarter. You weren't formally a candidate for the SVP position." He couldn't meet her eyes. He was confirming it. This wasn't a last-minute change of heart. It was a calculated, deliberate exclusion. She had never even been in the running. The entire narrative of her impending promotion had been a fiction, a lie she had been allowed, encouraged to believe. Then came the final killing blow. Eleanor turned her head slowly, mechanically, to look at Rachel Peters, who was now accepting a handshake from the CFO. Rachel caught her gaze, and for a moment, the mask of humility slipped. Beneath it was a flash of pure, unadulterated triumph. She walked over, her steps light and confident. "Eleanor," she said, her voice dripping with sickly sweet concern. "I'm so sorry if this was a surprise. Mark and I have been working so closely on the global strategy framework for weeks now. It all happened so fast." She placed a hand on Eleanor's shoulder, a gesture of faux sympathy that felt like a brand. "I guess I forgot to mention it." Forgot to mention it. The 3 words landed with perfect, devastating precision. It was the casual cruelty of it that finally broke through the shock. The lie was so blatant, so insulting. Rachel hadn't forgotten. She had savored it. She had watched Eleanor walk into this meeting, knowing the humiliation that awaited her. Eleanor looked from Rachel's grinning face to her husband's dismissive one. They were a team. And she was the punchline to their private joke. The coldness in her core solidified, turning from a hard knot into something sharp and jagged. This was not the end. This was the beginning. Eleanor didn't say another word. She didn't shout, she didn't cry, she didn't protest. To do so would be to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She would not give them that. With a calmness that terrified everyone in the room more than any outburst could have, she pushed her chair back. The sound of its legs scraping against the marble floor was unnaturally loud in the suffocating silence. She stood up, her posture perfect. She looked directly at Rachel, her gaze so empty of emotion that Rachel's triumphant smile faltered. Then she turned her eyes to Mark. She looked at her husband of 25 years, the man she had built a life and an empire with, and she saw a stranger. A cruel, smug stranger who had just immolated their shared history for the sake of a cheap thrill and a younger woman. "Congratulations," Eleanor said, her voice a flat, level monotone that betrayed nothing. She directed the word to the room at large, denying any single person the ownership of it. And then she turned and walked out of the boardroom. She didn't return to the sanctuary of her corner office, with its sweeping views and personal mementos. Instead, she walked directly to her desk, situated in the open-plan executive area just outside the glass-walled C-suite offices. Everyone was studiously ignoring her, their heads bent over keyboards, their faces illuminated by the glow of their monitors. But she could feel their awareness, a palpable tension that followed her like a shadow. She picked up the silver-framed photo of her and Mark on a trip to Italy, taken 10 years ago when they still looked at each other with genuine affection. She stared at it for a moment, then slid it into her leather tote bag. Next came a small, intricately carved wooden bird her father had given her for good luck. Then a fountain pen, a gift from her mentor after she'd closed her first big deal. Small, personal totems of a life she had built here. Ben, her assistant, approached her desk cautiously, his young face etched with worry. "Eleanor, is everything? Are you okay?" "I'm fine, Ben," she said, her voice still unervingly calm. "Please forward any of my outstanding project files to Ms. Peters." The name felt like ash in her mouth. "My personal emails should be deleted from the server." "But your afternoon schedule," he stammered. "My afternoon has just cleared up," she said, offering him a thin, brittle smile. With her few personal items secured in her bag, she performed her final act. She took the company-issued phone and placed it squarely in the center of her desk. Next to it, she laid her security badge, the one with her smiling, hopeful face taken 12 years ago. The plastic card, her key to the kingdom, now looked cheap and insignificant. Bag in hand, she walked towards the elevators, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous, silent space. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She knew Mark was watching her from his glass office, probably with a condescending pity, assuming this was the walk of a defeated woman. He was wrong. This was the walk of a woman setting down her weapons, only to go home and retrieve her arsenal. As she stepped into the elevator and the chrome doors slid shut, her reflection was no longer a woman of controlled power. It was a woman of cold, unadulterated fury. The architect had just been thrown out of her own cathedral. Now she was going to find the blueprints and bring the whole thing down. The 40-floor descent in the elevator was a slow-motion fall through a vacuum. Eleanor didn't stumble out into the lobby. She walked out with the same measured pace she had used to leave the boardroom. The doorman, accustomed to her confident stride, tipped his hat. "Have a good afternoon, Mrs. Vance." She nodded, the title now feeling like a costume she was about to shed. The drive home was a blur of traffic and gray cityscapes. Her hands were steady on the leather steering wheel of her Mercedes, but her mind was a raging inferno. She replayed the scene in the boardroom again and again, each detail sharpening the edges of her anger. Mark's laugh, Rachel's smirk, Robert Hemlock's cowardly refusal to meet her eye. They had not just betrayed her. They had underestimated her. They saw a wife, a partner, a COO. They had forgotten who she was before all that. Eleanor Kensington, a woman who had inherited not just her family's money, but their indomitable will. She pulled into the driveway of their large modern home in the suburbs, a house of glass and steel that she had designed, a house that was legally in her name. The coldness of the architecture suddenly seemed appropriate. Inside, the silence was vast and accusing. Photos of their life together lined the walls, mocking her. A wedding photo, ski trips, industry awards. It was a museum of a meticulously constructed lie. She didn't cry. Tears were a useless expense of energy. Instead, she moved with a chilling new purpose. She went to the shared home office, a room dominated by Mark's oversized mahogany desk. Her own workspace was a modest corner. She ignored it and went straight to the wall safe hidden behind a minimalist painting. She entered the code and pulled out a series of file folders containing her personal financial statements, the original deed to the house, and the prenuptial agreement they had signed 25 years ago. An agreement Mark's lawyers had drafted, but which her own father's famously shrewd attorneys had revised. Mark had laughed at the time, calling it a formality. With the documents secure in her tote bag, she walked into their master bedroom. She opened his closet, filled with his expensive tailor-made suits, and felt nothing. She systematically went through his drawers, his desk, looking for confirmation of what she already knew. It didn't take long. Tucked into the pocket of a travel blazer was a receipt from a high-end jewelry store dated 2 weeks ago. A diamond tennis bracelet. It certainly wasn't her anniversary, and her birthday was months away. That was all she needed. The final piece of shabby, predictable evidence. She returned to the kitchen, set her bag on the marble island, and made 2 phone calls. The first was to David Chen, her personal lawyer, a man whose discretion was as legendary as his sharp legal mind. "David, it's Eleanor Vance." "Eleanor, is everything all right?" he asked, his tone immediately alert. "There's been a change of circumstances at work and at home," she said, her voice like ice. "I need you to file for divorce. Immediately. And I need you to start the process of formally auditing my founding investment in Vance Innovations. Mark just made the biggest mistake of his life. I need you." There was a pause, then David's voice, low and serious. "I'm on it. I'll clear my schedule." The second call was to a number she hadn't dialed in over a year. An older, powerful voice answered on the second ring. "Eleanor." "Arthur," she said, speaking to her old mentor, a retired tech mogul who sat on the boards of a dozen major corporations. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Nonsense, my dear. To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I'm leaving Vance Innovations," she said simply. A heavy silence met her words. Arthur knew better than anyone what she meant to that company. "Was it Mark?" he finally asked, his voice laced with disapproval. "Yes," she replied. "Arthur, I need some advice. Not on how to find a new job, but on how to dismantle an empire." She could almost hear the slow, predatory smile forming on his face. "Eleanor," he said, "I thought you'd never ask." David Chen's office was a sanctuary of quiet, ruthless competence. Located in a sleek downtown skyscraper, it was furnished with minimalist pieces and law books bound in dark, serious leather. There was no clutter, only purpose. David himself was much the same. Sharp, impeccably dressed, with a mind that moved like a scalpel. He slid a file across his polished oak desk toward Eleanor. "The prenup is ironclad, just as your father insisted. The house, your personal portfolio, your inheritance, it's all untouchable. Mark gets his own holdings and a 50% stake in any assets acquired jointly during the marriage." "And the company?" Eleanor asked, her voice steady. This was the question upon which everything hinged. David leaned back, steepling his fingers. "This is where it gets interesting," he said, a glint in his eye. "Mark has always framed the narrative as him being the visionary and you being his partner. The media buys it, the board buys it. But the facts, as documented 25 years ago, tell a different story." He opened another file, this one thicker, its pages yellowed with age. "When you incorporated Vance Innovations, it was not funded by venture capital. It was funded by a single seed investment of $2 million. From my inheritance," Eleanor stated. It wasn't a question. Precisely. And Mark, in his youthful arrogance, was so desperate for the capital that he agreed to your father's terms without a fight. This wasn't a spousal gift, Eleanor. It was a formal investment. In exchange for the $2 million, you received a 40% stake of founders' equity. That equity is designated as non-dilutable in the corporate charter, meaning it could not be diminished by subsequent funding rounds. You are not just the COO, and you are not just his wife. You are, and have always been, the single largest shareholder in Vance Innovations. Eleanor felt a slow, cold wave of vindication wash over her. She had known this, of course, but had allowed the fact to become buried under 2 decades of marriage and partnership, under the carefully crafted myth of Mark Vance, the self-made man. "He's forgotten," Eleanor murmured. "Or he chose to forget. He thinks my stake is tied up in our joint marital assets." "He is about to be reminded," David said grimly. "He controls the board and the CEO seat, which gives him operational power. But you, Eleanor, own the ground the building sits on. We will file the divorce petition on the grounds of infidelity. That jewelry receipt is all the proof we need for that. But we will hold off on the corporate action. A quiet war is won by choosing the time and place of the first battle." "What's the first step?" she asked, feeling the familiar hum of strategic planning return, a feeling she hadn't realized she'd missed. "We let him think you're a scorned wife licking her wounds," David advised. "He'll expect you to fight for the house, for alimony. He won't be looking for a hostile takeover from within his own marriage. While he's busy celebrating with his new SVP, you will gather the ammunition you need to prove he is not only a bad husband but a terrible CEO. Eleanor left David's office feeling not lighter, but heavier, weighted with the power she had long abdicated. She had spent years being the engine in Mark's car. Now she was ready to take the wheel. Back in the sterile quiet of her glass and steel house, Eleanor sat at her personal laptop. It was a high-end machine, far more powerful than the standard-issue device she had left on her desk. 10 years ago, as Vance Innovations grew from a scrappy startup into a mid-size corporation, she had identified a critical flaw in their workflow. They were using a patchwork of off-the-shelf project management tools that didn't communicate with each other, leading to costly inefficiencies. So she had designed her own. Working with 2 trusted coders from R&D, she spent 6 months building Nexus, a proprietary project management and internal communications suite that integrated every department. It was her brainchild, a masterpiece of logic and efficiency that became the company's central nervous system. Mark had loved it, parading it to the board as another example of his company's forward thinking. He had never bothered to learn how it actually worked. Eleanor had. As the lead architect, she had built in a permanent, high-level administrative account for herself, for diagnostics and oversight. It was an account nobody in IT knew how to disable, and one they had all forgotten existed in the years since. She typed in the secure address, her fingers flying across the keyboard. A login screen appeared. She entered the credentials, a sequence based on her father's birthday and the name of his favorite sailboat. The system paused for a moment, then her screen blinked and resolved into the Nexus admin dashboard. She was in. She had full, unfettered access to everything. Emails, direct messages, project timelines, expense reports, server logs. It was the digital soul of Vance Innovations, and it was laid bare before her. She didn't start with Mark. That would be too obvious. She started with Rachel Peters. She pulled up her expense reports for the last 6 months. They were filled with extravagant dinners, 5-star hotel stays, and last-minute first-class flights, all co-signed by Mark and coded to vague project budgets like market research and client development. Eleanor cross-referenced the dates and locations with Mark's own calendar and travel records. The pattern was damningly clear. A solo business trip for Mark to a tech conference in Singapore coincided perfectly with Rachel expensing a week-long stay at the Marina Bay Sands. A series of client dinners in New York lined up with Rachel's receipts from high-end Manhattan boutiques. He wasn't just having an affair. He was funding it with company money. It was brazen, arrogant, and breathtakingly stupid. She methodically downloaded every report, every email, every calendar invite, creating a meticulous chronology of deceit and embezzlement. This wasn't just ammunition for a divorce proceeding anymore. This was a breach of fiduciary duty. This was the kind of malfeasance that got CEOs fired by their boards. For hours, she worked in silence, the only sound the soft click of her keyboard. She was no longer a wife discovering infidelity. She was a CEO uncovering a cancer within her own organization. And she knew, with the chilling certainty of a surgeon, that the only way to save the patient was to carve it out. 2 days later, Eleanor sat in a quiet, sun-drenched cafe far from the financial district. The aroma of coffee and pastries did little to warm the icy resolve that had settled deep within her. She was waiting for her first recruit. Dr. Eris Thorne arrived precisely on time, looking flustered and out of place. He was a genius in the lab, a man who could bend code to his will, but he was lost in any social situation that didn't involve a whiteboard. He clutched his worn messenger bag to his chest like a shield. "Eleanor," he said, sliding into the booth. "Your message was cryptic. Is everything all right? We're all very concerned." What Mark did was a business decision, Eris. Eleanor cut in smoothly, offering him a placid smile. "I'm fine. I wanted to talk to you about Project Chimera." Eris relaxed slightly at the mention of work. Project Chimera was his passion, a revolutionary new AI protocol that had the potential to redefine their industry. "We're hitting some roadblocks," he admitted, his brow furrowing. The Axiom integration is taking up most of our resources, and frankly, Rachel doesn't understand the technical specifications. She keeps asking for flashier demos instead of letting us refine the core algorithm. I see, Eleanor said, her expression unreadable. And what is your assessment of the Axiom project's leadership? Eris hesitated, looking around the cafe as if the walls might have ears. Between us, he whispered. It's a disaster. Rachel is promising the client features we can't deliver on the timeline she's approved. She's all confidence in the meetings, but my team is in a state of controlled panic. We warned her, but she told us to make it happen. You never did that, Eleanor. You always listened to our concerns. This was the confirmation she needed. Eris, I need you to document everything, she said, her voice low and firm. Every memo, every email where your team raises a concern and is ignored. Keep a private log of the project's trajectory. Do it for the good of the company. He looked at her, and for the first time, a glimmer of understanding dawned in his eyes. He wasn't just talking to his former boss. He was talking to a co-conspirator. He gave a single, sharp nod. I will. Her second meeting was an hour later, at a noisy wine bar. Maria Flores, the head of global sales, strode in with an air of barely concealed fury. She was direct, pragmatic, and had no time for fools. This is insane, Eleanor, she said, not even bothering with pleasantries as she slid into a bar stool. He put a glorified marketing intern in charge of global strategy. My team is losing faith. Our clients are getting nervous. They trusted you. And how are you managing that? Eleanor asked calmly, swirling the dark red wine in her glass. I'm doing damage control, what else? I'm telling them it's a temporary shake-up, that the fundamentals are strong. But they're not stupid. The team from Axiom has already called me twice with concerns. They signed a deal with Eleanor Vance, and now they're dealing with Rachel Peters. They can tell they've been handed a different product. Keep those relationships warm, Maria, Eleanor said, her gaze intense. Reassure them personally, but don't lie for the company. If they express official concerns, make sure those concerns are formally recorded and sent up the chain of command. Maria's sharp eyes narrowed. You have a plan. I have a vested interest in the long-term health of my company, Eleanor replied, a careful, deliberate choice of words. Maria smirked, taking a long sip of wine. Good. Because if you're planning on burning the place down, just tell me where to pour the gasoline. Eleanor smiled for the first time in days. It was a real smile, sharp and dangerous. The whispers had begun. The silent rebellion was taking root. Mark Vance leaned back in his new office chair, a ridiculously expensive ergonomic throne he'd ordered the day after Eleanor left, and admired the view. His office was no longer the Sears old space. He had taken over the premier corner office, the one Eleanor had always wanted but had deemed too ostentatious. From here, he could see the entire city spread out below him. He felt like a king surveying his domain. Rachel sat on the edge of his desk, her skirt hitched up slightly. She swirled the champagne in her flute. To us, she said, her voice a triumphant purr. The new power couple of Vance Innovations. To us, Mark agreed, clinking his glass against hers. Did you see the look on their faces in the meeting this morning? They're finally seeing what real leadership looks like. In the week since Eleanor's departure, Mark and Rachel had been on a victory tour. They'd held meetings, issued memos about a new, dynamic direction, and reveled in their newfound freedom. Mark felt invigorated, unshackled from what he now saw as Eleanor's cautious, plodding style. He had vision. He had charisma. Rachel was the same, bold, decisive, and wonderfully appreciative of his genius. How's the Axiom project coming along? He asked casually. It's great. Perfect, Rachel said a little too quickly. The client is demanding, but I've got them under control. Eris and his tech nerds are being a bit dramatic about the timeline, but that's their job. I told them we need to deliver, period. Good, Mark said, pleased. That's the kind of decisive action we need. Eleanor would have spent a month placating them and analyzing data. Sometimes you just have to crack the whip. He dismissed the slight nagging feeling that Eleanor's analyzing had saved them from several disastrous launches in the past. That was the old way of thinking. He was in charge now, and things would be different. He hadn't heard from Eleanor directly, only through a terse email from her new lawyer initiating divorce proceedings. He'd laughed when he read it. It was so predictable. She was hurt, emotional. She'd throw a tantrum, demand the house, and eventually, she would settle down and accept a generous settlement. He'd be magnanimous, of course. He wasn't a monster. She's probably sitting at home crying her eyes out, Rachel mused, tracing the rim of her glass. It's almost sad. She'll get over it, Mark said with a dismissive wave of his hand. She's a strong woman. But she was holding the company back. Holding me back. He truly believed it. He had convinced himself that Eleanor's meticulous planning was indecision. Her fiscal responsibility was a lack of vision, and her quiet competence was a threat to his own authority. Her absence felt like a breath of fresh air. He was completely blind to the fact that he had just fired the chief engineer of his ship and was now trying to navigate a storm with a first mate who only knew how to polish the brass. The iceberg was dead ahead, and he was popping champagne on the deck. Eleanor stood before a large whiteboard in the study of her house, a room Mark had never used. On its clean white surface, she had mapped out her entire strategy. It looked like the battle plan for a corporate invasion. Lines and arrows connected different boxes. Mark and Rachel embezzlement evidence was linked to formal complaint to board. Eris Thorne Project Chimera log and Maria Flores Axiom client communications both pointed to a larger box labeled operational negligence. Her own 40% founder stake was in a circle at the very top, a looming powerful piece labeled the kill switch. David Chen stood beside her, looking at the board with professional admiration. It's a multi-front war, he said. You're not just attacking his position as CEO. You're eroding his credibility from every possible angle. His credibility is a house of cards, Eleanor replied, her voice low. He built his reputation on my successes. I'm simply showing the world what the company looks like when I'm no longer holding it up. Over the past 2 weeks, the pieces had all fallen into place. Eris had been forwarding her daily logs, a grim litany of missed deadlines and ignored warnings on the Axiom project. Maria had sent summaries of her increasingly frantic calls with the Axiom executives, who were now formally threatening to invoke the penalty clauses in their contract. The financial documents she had downloaded from Nexus were now organized into a damning, irrefutable dossier of corporate malfeasance. The board meeting is in 10 days, David said, circling the date on the board. They'll be expecting a standard quarterly review. They will not be expecting this. The plan was sequenced with the precision of a military operation. Phase 1. 2 days before the board meeting, Maria would leak the Axiom client's formal letter of complaint to 2 of the more nervous independent board members, priming them with anxiety. Phase 2. The morning of the meeting, David would formally serve Mark with the divorce papers at the office, creating a scene and maximum psychological disruption. At the exact same time, he would deliver the complete dossier on Mark's financial misconduct to the board's chairman and legal counsel. Phase 3, the coup de grace. During the meeting, as Mark was reeling and on the defensive, Eleanor would leverage her shareholder rights to join the call, presenting herself not as the vengeful ex-wife, but as the company's silent, powerful co-founder, there to save her investment from a reckless and corrupt CEO. Eleanor looked at the completed battle plan, at the cold, hard logic of her own revenge. There was no fiery passion in her chest, only the quiet, satisfying hum of a complex machine about to be switched on. He thought I was just his wife, she said softly, more to herself than to David. He forgot I was his partner. He forgot I was a founder. She picked up a black marker and drew a final, bold line from her name directly to the box labeled CEO. Now, she said, capping the marker with a decisive click, I'm going to be his replacement. The news didn't arrive as a memo or an email. It arrived like a shockwave. Maria Flores was in the middle of her weekly sales meeting, trying to project an aura of confidence she was far from feeling, when her phone started vibrating violently on the table. Then another phone buzzed, and another. Within seconds, the entire room was lit by the blue glow of screens as the alert from the Financial Times spread through the team like a virus. Axiom Global terminates $80 million contract with Vance Innovations, citing catastrophic loss of confidence. Collective, audible gasp filled the room. $80 million. It wasn't just the company's biggest deal of the year. It was the flagship project that was meant to launch their new global strategy. It was Eleanor's final, brilliant achievement before her departure. And now it was a smoking crater. "Meeting's over," Maria snapped, her voice cutting through the rising panic. "Get back to your desks. I repeat, do not speak to the press. Refer all inquiries to corporate communications." As her team scattered, a mixture of fear and morbid excitement on their faces, Maria strode out of the conference room and headed straight for the executive suite. The open plan area was already a hive of panicked whispering. People were clustered around monitors, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. They all knew what this meant. This wasn't a setback, it was a public shaming. The phrase, catastrophic loss of confidence, was a corporate killshot, a signal to the entire industry that the company was in freefall. She saw Rachel Peters burst out of her office, her face pale and blotchy. She was talking frantically into her phone. "No, that's not accurate. The project was on track. They can't just..." Maria walked past her without a word. Her destination was Eris Thorne's office in the R&D wing. She found him standing by his window, looking down at the city traffic below. "You saw the news," she said. It wasn't a question. "I saw the inevitable," Eris replied, his voice heavy. He turned from the window. In his hand he held a thin data drive. "I've been documenting the project's decay for 3 weeks. Every missed milestone, every ignored warning, every technically impossible demand from Ms. Peters. It's all here." "Good," Maria said, taking the drive. "Eleanor will need this." "This is going to get ugly, isn't it?" Eris asked, looking more like a worried academic than a department head. Maria gave him a grim smile. She looked back toward the chaos unfolding in the executive suite, at the headless chickens running around in expensive suits, and felt a surge of cold, hard clarity. "Ugly doesn't even begin to describe it," she said. "This is the first domino. And it was pushed by a ghost." Mark Vance felt like he was trying to hold water in his fists. The Axiom news had shattered the arrogant calm of his new reign. His phone hadn't stopped ringing for 3 hours. Investors, board members, even his golf buddies were calling, all asking the same question. How could you let this happen? He was currently pacing his cavernous office, a bottle of antacids on his desk. Rachel was curled in one of the leather armchairs, alternating between defensive anger and tears. "It's not my fault," she insisted for the 10th time. "It's that condescending prick Eris Thorne and his team of lazy engineers. They were deliberately slow walking the project to make me look bad." "Nobody cares whose fault it is, Rachel," Mark roared, his voice raw with panic. "They care that $80 million just evaporated. Our stock is going to tank when the market opens." His bravado was gone, replaced by a raw, desperate fear he hadn't felt in years. He was a visionary, a dealmaker. He didn't handle messes like this. That had always been Eleanor's job. She was the one who could calm frantic clients, who could find elegant solutions in the middle of a 5-alarm fire. He had fired his best firefighter and then set the house ablaze. An urgent chime came from his desktop. An email from Harrison Shaw, the chairman of the board. Subject: urgent. Emergency board meeting. Mark: in light of the disastrous Axiom news and other disturbing reports I have received, I am calling an emergency meeting of the board for 10 a.m. tomorrow. You are expected to provide a full and frank explanation for this catastrophic failure. Harrison. Other disturbing reports. The word sent a fresh spike of acid into Mark's stomach. What other reports? He'd been so focused on Axiom. He hadn't considered what else might be happening. Had someone gone to the board behind his back? It's a witch hunt, he muttered, reading the email aloud to Rachel. They're looking for a scapegoat. You're the CEO, Rachel said, her voice trembling slightly. You can handle them. Just tell them it was an unforeseen complication. Blame the client for making unreasonable demands. We can spin this. Mark nodded, trying to seize on her words. Yes, he could spin this. He was Mark Vance. He could sell anything. He would go into that meeting, project confidence, and place the blame squarely on Axiom's inflexible management and his own team's failure to execute. He would promise a new, more robust strategy. He would survive this. He had to. He spent the rest of the night preparing, building a presentation filled with corporate jargon and carefully manipulated data, a fortress of lies to protect himself. He was so focused on deflecting the professional attack that he was completely unprepared for the personal one that was scheduled to arrive first. At precisely 9:15 a.m. the next morning, as Mark was striding through the executive floor trying to project an aura of calm authority, a man in a crisp, inexpensive suit intercepted him. "Mark Vance?" the man asked, holding a large manila envelope. "Yes, I'm on my way to a meeting," Mark said dismissively, attempting to brush past him. "This won't take a moment, sir," the man said, his expression neutral. "You've been served." He thrust the envelope into Mark's hands and turned and walked away before Mark could even process the words. Process server. Here. In the middle of his office, in front of a dozen of his employees who were now staring wide-eyed. A hot, mortifying flush crept up his neck. He ripped open the envelope. The first words on the thick legal document were Eleanor Kensington Vance versus Mark Vance. Petition for dissolution of marriage. He scanned the page, his vision blurring with rage. Adultery. Misappropriation of marital assets. Irreconcilable differences. She had filed for divorce. Course she had. But to do it here now. On the morning of the most important meeting of his career. It was a calculated, vicious move designed to unnerve him. At that exact moment across town, David Chen was walking into the august marble lobby of the building that housed Harrison Shaw's private equity firm. "David Chen to see Mr. Shaw," he said to the receptionist. "He's expecting me." 5 minutes later, he was sitting across a large, antique desk from the formidable chairman of the Vance Innovations Board. Harrison was in his late 60s, with a mane of white hair and eyes that had seen everything. "This had better be worth my time, Mr. Chen," Harrison said, his voice a low rumble. "I have a corporate dumpster fire to attend to this morning." "I believe this is the gasoline," David said, pushing a thick, spiral-bound dossier across the desk. "From my client, Eleanor Vance." Harrison put on a pair of reading glasses and opened the report. The first page was a summary, an evidentiary dossier on the gross financial mismanagement and breach of fiduciary duty by CEO Mark Vance. For 10 minutes, the only sound in the room was the soft rustle of paper as Harrison turned page after page. He saw the falsified expense reports, the receipts for lavish gifts to Rachel Peters, coded as business expenses, the first-class flights and 5-star hotels disguised as client-facing trips. He saw a meticulous, undeniable, and deeply sordid account of a CEO using his company as a personal piggy bank to fund an affair. When he finally looked up, his face was like stone. The corporate dumpster fire he had mentioned suddenly had a clear and obvious source. "Mr. Chen," Harrison said, his voice dangerously quiet, "please inform your client that her concerns have been received, and they will be acted upon." The first inkling Rachel had that the crisis had escalated beyond her control was when her friend from the marketing department sent her a text message at 9:45 a.m. It contained a single link and one word: OMG. Rachel clicked the link. It was to the online edition of Forbes. The headline was a punch to the gut. Sex, Lies and Spending. Inside the Corporate Rot at Vance Innovations. CEO Mark Vance accused of embezzlement and mismanagement amidst affair with subordinate. Name. Her name was in the first paragraph. The story was brutal, filled with specific damning details that could only have come from inside the company. It mentioned the Singapore trip, the jewelry, the falsified expense reports. It painted a picture not of a rising star, but of a conniving homewrecker who had traded favors for a promotion she didn't deserve. An anonymous source was quoted as saying, "She was a symptom of the rot, not the cause. The company has been mismanaged for months." The story spread through the office like wildfire. The hushed whispers were replaced by open staring. She felt hundreds of eyes on her, judging, condemning. Her authority, already fragile, evaporated in an instant. She was no longer a senior vice president. She was a tabloid headline. She fled to her office and locked the door, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold her phone. She tried to call Mark, but it went straight to voicemail. He was preparing for the board meeting, completely oblivious to the public relations nuke that had just detonated. The article was the final, devastating blow. The Axiom contract loss had been a business failure. This was a moral one. It was sordid, ugly, and personal. It gave the board the moral cover they needed to do what was necessary. It wasn't just about a bad deal anymore. It was about the fundamental integrity of the company's leadership. Employees, once fearful of Mark's wrath, now felt emboldened. The loyalty they had held for Eleanor, long suppressed, began to surface. An anonymous email from an R&D address was sent to the entire board, attaching Eris Thorne's detailed log of the Axiom project's mismanagement under Rachel's leadership. Then another email followed from someone in sales, detailing client concerns that had been ignored for weeks. The walls of Mark's fortress of lies were not just being breached, they were being torn down, brick by brick, by the very people he thought he commanded. The unraveling was happening in real time, and it was faster and more brutal than anyone could have imagined. Mark Vance walked into the emergency board meeting looking like a man who had aged 10 years in a single morning. The divorce papers had shaken him, but he still believed he could control the narrative in the room. He had no idea the room was already lost to him. The 6 board members sat around the table, their faces grim. No one made eye contact. The chairman, Harrison Shaw, gestured to a chair. "Mark, sit." "Harrison, before we begin, I want to address the vicious, unfounded rumors that are circulating," Mark began, his voice strained. "They are not rumors, Mark," Harrison cut him off, his voice like chipping ice. He slid the dossier David Chen had delivered across the table. "This is evidence." Mark's blood ran cold as he saw the cover page. He opened it and saw his own falsified expense reports, his signature next to Rachel's extravagant purchases. He was trapped. For the next 20 minutes, the board grilled him mercilessly. They questioned him about the Axiom contract. They dissected his affair-funded travel. They read aloud quotes from the Forbes article. Mark's blustering defenses grew weaker and weaker, his lies more and more transparent. He was cornered, humiliated, and utterly alone. "This is a betrayal," he finally stammered, looking around the table. "A personal vendetta from a bitter, scorned woman. She is trying to destroy me." "On the contrary," a calm, familiar voice said, emanating from the large video screen at the end of the table. "She is trying to save her investment." The screen, previously dark, was now lit up, and on it was Eleanor Vance. She was not in an office or a boardroom. She was in what looked like a comfortable, elegant study. She was dressed in a simple but powerful cream-colored blouse. Her expression was serene, her gaze direct. She looked completely in control. A board member, a woman named Catherine who had always been friendly with Eleanor, spoke up. "As the company's largest single shareholder, Ms. Vance has exercised her right to be present at this meeting." Mark stared at the screen, dumbfounded. This was her plan. All of it. The client, the divorce, the dossier, the media. A perfectly orchestrated campaign to destroy him. "Mark," Eleanor said, her voice devoid of any emotion except a kind of clinical disappointment. You have leveraged this company's resources for personal gain, alienated our biggest client through incompetence, and exposed us to ridicule and scandal. You have not been a leader. You have been a liability." She then turned her attention to the rest of the board. "Gentlemen, Catherine, Vance Innovations is more than its name. It is the product of 25 years of work, funded by my family's money and built on the backs of employees who deserve better leadership. I am not here as an ex-wife. I am here as the true founder of this company, and I am formally requesting that the board hold a vote of no confidence in CEO Mark Vance, effective immediately." Her words hung in the dead silent room. It was checkmate. She hadn't just taken his queen. She had cornered his king from across the board, using pieces he never even knew she had. Mark looked from her calm, powerful face on the screen to the hard, unforgiving faces of his board members. He was finished. The silence in the boardroom following Eleanor's declaration was absolute. It was the heavy, final silence of a sealed tomb. Mark Vance stared at his wife's image on the screen, his face a contorted mask of disbelief and incandescent rage. He looked around at the stone-faced board members, searching for an ally, a flicker of doubt, and found nothing. He was a king who had just discovered his throne was made of paper and his castle was a mirage. Harrison Shaw, the chairman, didn't even put it to a lengthy debate. A motion has been put forward for a vote of no confidence in CEO Mark Vance. All in favor. 6 hands, including Catherine's, went up without hesitation. All opposed. Only Mark's hand remained on the table, clenched into a white-knuckled fist. "The motion carries," Harrison announced, his voice flat and final. "Mark, your employment with Vance Innovations is terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the premises." "You can't do this," Mark finally roared, surging to his feet. "This is my company. I built this." "No, Mark." Eleanor's voice cut through his tirade, calm and clear from the screen. "We built it, and you tried to burn it down. The board is simply protecting its investment." 2 uniformed security guards, who had clearly been waiting just outside the door, entered the room. They were large, impassive men, and their presence sucked the last of the fight out of Mark. His shoulders slumped. The arrogant, charismatic CEO was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out man in an expensive suit. They didn't put their hands on him, but their proximity was a form of restraint in itself. As they guided him to the door, he stopped and looked back at the screen, at the woman who had so completely and systematically dismantled his life. "Eleanor," he began, his voice a pathetic croak. "Goodbye, Mark," she said, and with a quiet click, her image vanished, leaving the screen black. His walk of shame was the complete inverse of Eleanor's dignified exit weeks earlier. Where hers had been silent and self-determined, his was a spectacle of defeat. Employees emerged from their cubicles to watch, their faces not of pity, but of a kind of grim satisfaction. He was no longer the powerful CEO. He was the subject of the day's most delicious gossip. He didn't carry a tote bag with a few personal mementos. He left with nothing but the clothes on his back, his mind still reeling from the speed of his own destruction. When the elevator doors closed on his shin-faced visage, it wasn't just the end of his career. It was the end of an era built on a lie. With Mark gone, Eleanor's first order of business was dealing with the lingering infection. She didn't come to the office the next day in a blaze of glory. She arrived an hour before anyone else, walking through the quiet halls of the company she now controlled. Her company felt right. At 9 a.m. she sent a one-line email to Rachel Peters. "My office. Now." Rachel arrived looking like a ghost. The defiance and ambition had been replaced by raw, undisguised fear. She had been publicly disgraced in the press and knew she was a dead woman walking. She clutched her purse in front of her like a shield. Eleanor was seated behind the large desk in the premier corner office, the office Mark had taken, the office she now occupied. She didn't invite Rachel to sit. She simply observed her for a long moment. "I suppose you're here to fire me," Rachel said, her voice thin and reedy. Your employment was forfeit the moment you conspired with the CEO to defraud this company, Eleanor stated, her tone clinical, as if discussing a line item on a budget. The board has already approved your termination for cause. Your security badge is disabled, and your network access has been revoked. A box with your personal effects will be couriered to you. Rachel seemed to shrink under the cold, factual weight of the dismissal. A flicker of her old fire returned, fueled by desperation. You did this to get back at him, didn't you? This was all because he chose me over you. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. For the first time, she allowed a sliver of her true feelings to show. Not anger, but a profound and dismissive pity. Let me be very clear, Rachel, she said, her voice dropping to a low, cutting whisper. Mark's affair was merely a data point, a confirmation of his poor judgment. It was the catalyst, not the cause. You were a symptom of his rot, not the disease. This was never just about you. The words landed with the intended effect. Eleanor denied Rachel the one thing she craved, the starring role in the drama. She was being told she was irrelevant, a footnote in a much larger story of corporate succession. The humiliation was absolute. So that's it, Rachel whispered, tears welling in her eyes. You ruin my life and you don't even care. You made your choices, Eleanor said, her voice returning to its impassive state. You gambled your career on a man's ego, and you lost. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a company to run. She turned her attention to her computer screen, a clear and final dismissal. Rachel stood there for another moment, utterly broken, before turning and walking out of the office, out of the company, and out of Eleanor's life forever. An hour later, Eleanor convened an all-hands meeting in the company's main auditorium. The atmosphere was thick with anxiety and speculation. When she walked onto the stage, a hush fell over the crowd. Good morning, she began, her voice calm and amplified by the microphone. As you know, there has been a change in leadership. The board has appointed me interim CEO. She paused, letting that sink in. I know the last few weeks, and especially the last 48 hours, have been filled with uncertainty and damaging speculation. I am not going to stand up here and pretend the problems outlined in the press don't exist. They do. They are the result of a failure of leadership and a loss of integrity at the very top. That era is over. She saw a wave of relief ripple through the audience. Our company is not defined by the actions of two people. It is defined by the brilliant, innovative work that you all do every day. My only mission is to create a culture of transparency, trust, and excellence where that work can thrive. Effective immediately, I am promoting Dr. Eris Thorne to Chief Technology Officer. Eris, sitting in the front row, looked up in stunned surprise. And Maria Flores will be taking on the role of Chief Operating Officer. Maria, standing at the back of the room, broke into a slow, wide grin. The auditorium erupted in spontaneous, genuine applause. These were respected leaders, competent people who had been sidelined by Mark's politics. Their promotions sent a clear signal. Competence, not sycophancy, would now be rewarded. My first call this morning, Eleanor continued once the applause died down, was to the CEO of Axiom Global. I have conveyed my sincerest apologies for our recent failures, and I have scheduled a meeting with them for next week to begin the process of rebuilding that relationship and earning back their trust. It was a masterclass in crisis management. In 10 minutes, she had acknowledged the problem, established her authority, signaled a new cultural direction, and laid out a clear first step toward recovery. The fear in the room was replaced by a tentative, but palpable sense of hope. As the meeting concluded, people flocked around her, congratulating her, thanking her. She was no longer just the founder or the betrayed wife. She was their leader. Walking back to her office, she felt the weight of the responsibility, but it was a good weight. It was the weight of purpose. The legal battles ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. Faced with irrefutable evidence of financial and marital misconduct, Mark's lawyers advised him to surrender on all fronts. He had no leverage, no allies, and no credibility. The divorce and the corporate settlement were negotiated in tandem. David Chen was merciless. Eleanor's 40% founder's stake was reaffirmed as her sole, separate property. In the divorce, she was awarded the house and her own investments, as per the prenup. The real blow to Mark was the disposition of his own shares. To avoid a protracted and embarrassing shareholder lawsuit for his breach of fiduciary duty, he was forced to sell his entire stake in the company. And the only buyer, offering a price severely depressed by the recent scandal he himself had caused, was Eleanor. When the ink was dry, Eleanor Vance was the undisputed majority shareholder, holding over 70% of the company she had co-founded. Mark was left with a fraction of his former fortune and a reputation so toxic, he would be lucky to ever sit on a corporate board again. A week after the final papers were signed, Eleanor was in the Home Office, sorting through the last of Mark's personal files before having them sent to his new, much smaller apartment. Tucked away on a forgotten backup drive, she found a folder labeled Drafts. Inside was a single unsent email, dated 5 years prior. It was addressed to his late father. "Dad," it read. "Had a close call today. Almost lost the Henderson deal. Eleanor saved it at the last minute, as usual. Sometimes I don't know what I'd do without her. The truth is, this whole thing, the company, the success, it's built on her brains and your money she inherited. I'm just the guy out front selling the story. Don't ever tell her I said that." Eleanor read the words, the secret, cowardly admission he could never make to her face. She felt a flicker of something. Not pain, not anger, but a kind of final, weary validation. She had known it all along. She dragged the file to the trash icon on her desktop and clicked, "Empty trash." She didn't need his secret admission anymore. The world knew the truth now, because she had shown them. 6 months later, Eleanor stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of her CEO office. The nameplate on the door no longer said Vance Innovations. After a company-wide vote, it had been rebranded. It was now Nexus Strategic, named after the elegant software architecture that had always been its true heart. The company was thriving. Under Maria's operational guidance and Eris's technological vision, Nexus was more innovative and profitable than ever. They had even won back the Axiom contract, signing a new, more ambitious deal 3 months ago. Eleanor looked out at the sprawling city skyline, the lights beginning to twinkle as dusk settled. Her life was her own on her own terms. The revenge had been a means to an end. It had been a necessary fire to clear away the dead wood, but the real satisfaction came from what she was now building in its place. She was no longer the architect of someone else's success, or the engine for someone else's vision. The triumphs were hers. The future was hers. The empire was hers. Her phone buzzed, not with a crisis, but with a text from Catherine, her friend on the board. "Dinner Friday." Eleanor smiled, a genuine relaxed smile that reached her eyes. She typed back a simple reply. "I'd love that." She was not just a CEO, a founder, or a strategist. She was Eleanor. And for the first time in a very long time, that was more than enough. And that's how Eleanor proved that the best revenge isn't just winning, it's taking over completely. Now I want to know what you think. Was her takedown a masterful act of justice, or did she go too far? Comment justice below if you were cheering for her the whole time. Or comment too far if you think she should have just walked away with her money. I can't wait to see whose side you're on in the comments. Thanks for watching.